Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. Today, friend of the show Max returns to talk about the Twilight Zone-esque demonic horror film I Trapped the Devil, which is currently streaming on Hulu. Max, welcome back to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Not bad. I was happy to have you on again. The last two conversations were so great, so I thought this time I would throw you kind of a curveball movie. Since the last two we talked about were very much kind of like folk horror.
Yep.
I couldn't think of a more kind of different genre, subgenre horror film to talk about today. But what did you think of I Trapped the Devil?
Yeah, so definitely way different than the other two. The first watch through, I did not like it. I think it was so different. I guess so far as like the budget and kind of the size of the movie was so different than the other two, and so it caught me off guard. But you made, I think we discussed it after my first watch through, and you kind of mentioned that it was almost like an extended version of the Twilight Zone. And so on my second watch, going at it through that lens, through that context, I enjoyed it 100% more. It was, I think I adjusted my expectations with the title of a movie, like I Trapped the Devil. You kind of expect something really big, like big scares, kind of more or less a larger budget. I don't know what the budget is for this movie, but I expected it to be almost like The Conjuring, like a lot of images of the devil and demons and everything, but it was really simple. Super simple, and I appreciate it. It's definitely a movie that grew on me.
Yeah, so I think that's probably I should have given you better warning in terms of just like the expectations for the movie, since the last two were both Netflix horror movies and in terms of like the massive budget that goes along with those. But yeah, I'm just like you. I really can appreciate the kind of minimalist storytelling that the focus is not on like a big in your face kind of depiction of the devil or demons in the traditional sense that we're used to. But I think really what the film excels at is highlighting sort of the atmosphere, and it's more focused on the characters rather than a literal depiction of the devil. But so I Trapped the Devil, for those that don't know, is written and directed by Josh Lobo. And it's about a couple, Matt and Karen, who plan an unexpected visit to Matt's brother Steve for the holidays. Though once they arrive, Steve seems strangely spooked, and he attempts to get them to leave. And he soon reveals that his terror is due to him believing that he's trapped the devil in his basement. So generally, do you like slow burn horror films?
Yeah, I like them if I'm expecting them to be a slow burn, right. But yeah, I really enjoyed this movie for its simplicity. I think there was a lot to pick apart, especially between the relationships of the characters. So like, what was your opinion of the simplicity of it? Like, do you feel like the character focused script worked for this?
Yeah, so I reviewed this movie last year, I think, for a website, and I kind of went in expecting it to be very kind of like lo-fi, low budget. So I was more looking to see the ways in which they could use things like the script and kind of like the atmosphere, like I had said, about depicting this kind of like oppressive demonic aura, so to speak, instead of something like, oh, there's going to be a devil that pops out of this corner, or you literally see some type of demon. But I think that in taking that angle where it's more focused on the character relationships and kind of just how oppressive the house is really what the film capitalizes on. And honestly, it makes it a scarier film because, I mean, you mentioned you were expecting something similar to The Conjuring. While I enjoy movies like that, a lot of the times those movies, they hit the same kind of 3 bullet points and you very much know what to expect. And so it's almost like I don't really find those movies that scary anymore. It's more, I can appreciate and I enjoy them, but they're not really evolving on the types of scares. It's kind of just the same things over and over.
Yeah. The way like the house itself is,
Mm-hmm.
really creepy. It looks
Yeah.
like it almost seems like Steve was squatting in the house
Mm-hmm.
instead of him like actually kind of living there. And I think as when they first introduced all the characters, you like as soon as they walk in, there's this like really heavy family drama.
Yeah. You
Steve
can feel
and Matt.
that tension.
Yeah, Steve and Matt obviously had a falling out of some sort, and I think right away you're uncomfortable, and it's not uncomfortable in the supernatural sense. It's like the uncomfortable family, and I think that Joshua Lobo did a really good job, maintaining this level of awkwardness between the three characters. And so I you yourself having a brother, and I have a couple brothers, do you think the relationship between Steve and Matt is accurate, or like,
Yeah, I think that
believable?
those two I think they do a really good job of having the dynamic of brothers that have this obstacle in front of them that they just can't get past in terms of there's like a strain in the relationship, and you see it a lot in Matt, who's played by AJ Bowen, and he's very much kind of like, I'm over this. I really don't even want to have this fight again that they've clearly had numerous times over the years, and really his wife Karen is the one who's just like forcing him to make the effort. But it is very much like brothers in the sense that neither of them want to start the conversation that they need to have when there's
Right.
clearly an issue going on between them.
Yeah.
What did you think?
I thought it was accurate.
No.
And they do care about each other, but they're also very much sick of each other. There's a
already,
one scene,
and they just got there.
right, and Steve pretty much goes straight up to the bedroom, pours himself a drink, and I think that pretty much they have a drink in their hands the entire time. So this strained relationship is definitely felt and fairly relatable. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Steve, who's played by Scott Poitras, gives the best performance in the film, and I think a lot of the early on, not only tension but kind of just like the sense of unease in that there's something going on. Obviously, we know there's something else going on, but it just in terms of before we even realize the kind of predicament that he has found himself in, and now Karen and Matt have found themselves in, I think just the little things of how scared he is right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Like, it's not even a sense of when they come in and he's like, you guys can't stay here. He looks like rattled. It's not kind of like he's shouting and he's looking to pick a fight. It's almost like he's trying to warn them, like, you just can't stay here. It's too dangerous.
Right.
And we really see that throughout the entire film with him up until we kind of learn about what's in the basement. And the one thing that stood out to me a lot on this rewatch was his reaction every time the phone rings. Because obviously we know that it's the devil that he's trapped in the basement is somehow using their powers to communicate with him through the phone. But just every time the phone rings, his reaction to it ringing is just like super unsettling. And to the point that the other characters notice, it's not just something the audience notices.
Yeah. And so I was, so how do you think the devil's influence, is it, because I was kind of curious as the devil's influence, not only on them, but on the outside world, because he mentioned that, something is coming. And, it shows that every time, they lift the cross off the door, the devil can then speak to them. And so do you think that some of the devil's minions are out kind of still doing his dirty work, calling the phone, or, kind of influencing Steve and Karen to come visit? Because like you said, it was kind of a sudden visit. And when they get to the attic, that attic scene where Steve talks about, it wasn't really a coincidence that you guys came here. Is that Steve being unhinged, or do you think it's a true influence of the devil in his basement?
No, I think that's the true influence, is that the devil is not having like a physical like henchman come to the house. It's literally using Steve's own brother as its henchman, somehow influencing it. Because we see periodically that Steve goes down to the basement and takes the cross off and just taunts the devil, basically. And he says at one point, he's like, how does it feel to be trapped in there? And we see the devil like struggle trying to open up the door. But it really is about the film portraying this idea that the devil is able to influence certain aspects in your life to use against you. And to Lobo's credit, the way that he kind of approaches this kind of familiar idea about the devil and the powers that it has is that he makes us question Steve's sanity from the outset. Like, and obviously Matt and Karen are convinced that he's out of his mind because they see the houses, the windows are all covered in paper and the lights are off for the most part. And it looks like a shut-in basically, or a hoarder. But then he starts talking about the devil, and just the way that they present this idea just really, it calls into question throughout the whole movie. Like, is he out of his mind or is he onto something?
Right.
And that, I mean, initially I thought it was really well done to the point that I was like, I started second guessing myself. Because at first I was like, he's definitely crazy just because of how erratic he is and how he starts to kind of like amp himself up almost in this, this like demonic mania. But then at the end of the movie, like we find out things are the way they are.
You know, halfway through the movie, they kind of explain why Steve is so stressed. You know, his family ended up dying, and so they thought that maybe he trapped the guy, or he kidnapped the man who led to his family's death. And so, like you said, I started questioning his sanity, and then maybe in fact it's not the literal devil that he trapped, but Steve's interpretation of the devil. Like that guy, he considers the devil, and so that's who he kidnapped him. But that kind of pivotal scene where Karen's down there, she pulls the cross off, the devil's pleading with her to open it, and then there's that pause, and it's like, oh, you're hesitating. Is it because of what I did to them? And I was like, oh shit. Like it's actually, the devil, the devil's actually there. And that flip of, please help me. Oh, okay. You got me. I did it. I think it was a pretty powerful thing, and that now Karen knows for sure. Before she did it, now she knows. And I think Lobo's depiction of the devil, because the whole time I was thinking that, why would the devil kind of be stuck behind these flimsy locks? I think if we were in that situation, I'm pretty sure we would be able to like kick the door down. But the devil stays down there for, I think, 2 years. But this depiction of the devil whispering in your ear constantly, and Matt goes into the explanation of those two different kinds of evil, I think makes the devil actually a more powerful, not physically powerful, but manipulation and more mentally powerful over people.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, the depiction of the devil in this I love, just because of how you don't even see it until the last 2 minutes of the movie or something like that. And it just becomes more increasingly sinister because it really feeds into this idea that like Steve is crazy and he's kidnapped some random guy, or he's kidnapped the man that he finds responsible for his wife and daughter's death in a car crash. But just like how the way that it escalates in the portrayal of the devil, and that when he takes the cross off the first time, it's this like very deep voice that's pleading. But again, like the way that film shot, like the light bulb in the basement is red. So it's this kind of like neon shadows in the basement, and the way that like the camera kind of, exactly. It turns the basement basically into hell. And even though you don't see the devil for a majority of the film, a lot of weight is given to that voice, and not just because it's so deep and it's so foreign to almost sounding human, but it is this idea that it begins with pleading. And then, like you said, when Karen is about to use the hammer to pry the locks off, he goes, oh, you hesitated. And all of a sudden it's just like, wait a minute, how would he know that? And then he starts laughing, and then he says, almost got you, didn't I? And it just like that scene, even though I've watched this one time previously, like that's kind of like a gut punch moment where you realize like, oh, I've been doubting somebody that in actuality I should have been listening to the entire time. And of course that's how Karen feels in that moment.
Yeah, it's a unique take on it. And, how do you feel like, obviously the devil's influence on Steve and Karen is pretty immediate. But do you think, a lot of Steve being unhinged, and especially that attic scene where he has all the cord connecting these crimes versus demons and everything, do you think
that's one of my favorite shots of the whole movie, by the way?
Yeah,
that's such a crazy scene.
It is. And so, Matt said, you should have called me before this. And the Devil's, he was there for 2 years with the Devil. Mm-hmm. And yet, he didn't, he was able to more or less resist the influence. Does that make, does Matt's, former grief, does that make him a stronger person than Karen or Steve? Or like, how do you interpret kind of Matt or Steve guarding the Devil for that long? Like, how do you think that affected his psyche?
I mean,
especially towards the end.
Mm-hmm. I think the Devil probably, like, you would initially think that somebody that's that broken in terms of like the tragedy that he suffered and the grief that he deals with on a continuous basis makes him very susceptible. When in actuality, like, he realizes that he has no faith in anything because of what happened to him. So in actuality, like, he becomes the worst person to be the captor of the Devil in a sense, where it's just like, this is my goal now. I'm not going to assume that like some higher power is going to help me here. All I can do is be the guardian of this evil. And then you have this couple show up that reminds him constantly. He even says it to Karen at one point, I think, or he says it to Steve or to Matt, like, oh, I used to have that, or like, I'm envious of that, basically, his relationship with his wife. And it's like, you look at Matt and Karen, and they have this idyllic relationship, and they are very strong in their belief and their love for one another. But in that like love for one another, I think there's vulnerability there. This idea that they assume that this terrible thing could never happen to them because they haven't experienced anything like that. So it almost makes them the ones that are more susceptible to the Devil's will. And we see that eventually, like, he almost gets Karen at one point. And then towards the end of the film, they have that role reversal where Matt goes from being the skeptic to the one that is like, hey, we're going to open this door. And Karen turns into the one who's like, you cannot open that door. And we see how that plays out.
Exactly. Do you like the pacing of the movie? I felt it was, the second watch, I thought it was better than the first one.
Yeah.
First watch.
I think definitely on the first, I would agree that the pacing is, like, I described this as a slow burn, and it definitely is slow in the beginning. But I think, again, on a rewatch, you start to appreciate more that atmosphere that we talked about early on, where you walk, like, the very first scene of the movie, the door has to be, like, bashed in by the cops that are walking in, because we get that brief flash forward of them coming into the house, and it's like, immediately that grabs you, like, why is this door boarded up to keep something out or to keep something in? And then kind of just, again, we have all the windows are covered in paper, and it looks like a squat. Like you said, you don't know if Steve's squatting there or not. So I definitely like was able to soak in more of the atmosphere. In paying attention to that atmosphere more so on a rewatch, the scenes where characters are like, you felt that, right? You almost feel that yourself, just because you feel like these characters are in a place from the opening minutes of the movie that they just shouldn't be.
Right. The air is really heavy, pretty much the entire movie. Yeah.
I mean, go ahead. So Steve, I think, again, Scott gives the best performance, I think. But what did you think of Matt and Karen's performances? Because I think Scott does a lot. Scott Poythress does a lot of the heavy lifting throughout the movie.
Yeah, and I think so. And I think they are. I think they do a good job supporting Scott's performance. There is that, plenty of doubt from Karen, plenty of doubt from Matt. And there's also that, Matt wants to believe his brother. There were a couple, I think with Karen, they first went down and introduced themselves to the Devil, more or less. Matt was like, all right, let's take a step back. What if this is actually the Devil? What if? And Karen was like, no, there's a man down there. Your brother trapped him. We can't be a part of this. We have to get out. And so that relationship that, those guys portrayed, the brotherly relationship, I think is pretty accurate. I think they did a good job. I thought it was corny, the first walkthrough. I thought it was they were a little overacting. But
Mm-hmm.
The second watch, when I paid more attention to the characters instead of expecting the devil to come out, it changed the context and it changed the atmosphere a little bit. So I felt they did a pretty good job. I wouldn't knock them for anything, really.
Yeah, I think for me on a rewatch though, it's just more noticeable that Steve is just the more, I guess, engaging character, even though he talks the least, just in terms of like, I was really latching onto this idea that he is a prisoner in his own home, essentially, in a lot of ways. Like, no matter, even though he's on the other side of that or the basement locker that the devil's in, at the same time, like, we see that he boards up the doors and he's convinced like that the henchmen are going to come through the walls at any point. And he very much is a person that can't leave this house. And again, just him portraying a guy that's constantly terrified early on, and yet we don't know why he's scared in a lot of ways. And I found that super disturbing. So that way, when they cut from that to Karen and Matt up like in the room talking back and forth, I think that was a moment where I was just kind of like, I would rather know what's going on downstairs, just because that is the more terrifying moment. So we talked about how this is not very like conventional scares in a lot of ways. Like you said, the expectations were probably like more jump scare oriented or a more literal depiction of the devil. Do you think this movie would have benefited from a couple kind of conventional instances of horror? Or do you think that this movie made the right decision in leaning 100% into this kind of slow burn, unconventional sense?
It's hard to, yes and no. I think if they did more jump scares, it would have changed the movie. So if Josh Lobo, if you wanted to keep this, I think he described it as an art house horror. I think without doing the jump scares more so than, that television, the phone, and that one vision that Steve had about halfway to 3/4 through the movie, I think that kept it in, that wheelhouse, the art house wheelhouse. But, I also wouldn't have minded, maybe some windows being blown out, or even a voice at the end of the phone, that last phone call that he gets when he's kind of sick of it and he drops the phone and he kind of lets it dangle. I think having, maybe some disembodied laughter or like someone actually on the phone, hearing someone on the phone, I think that would have given me the demonic fix that I was kind of looking for.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed, I'm glad you brought those up because I almost forgot to mention them. The TV set is one of the recurring kind of, I wouldn't say it's a scare, but it's more just kind of like, again, this unconventional means of a demonic presence kind of reaching out, where we see the woman in the TV screen and then sometimes she's yelling and sometimes she's not. I would have liked more instances like that in terms of like these things that at face value are not necessarily super frightening. They're just like they're just strange. And I think more instances like that early on, especially, would have probably helped. Because like you said, the first time you watched it, you didn't enjoy it. And that's something that I've heard from a lot of people that I've talked to who have watched this movie, and that this grew on them, or they started enjoying it about halfway through. And I think that first half still is a little slow, especially if you're not clicking with a lot of kind of like the atmospheric things that the movie's doing.
Right.
But I was glad that you mentioned his vision or his hallucination, where first I believe it's supposed to be the man that caused the car accident with his wife and daughter that where they died, and he's like holding her stuffed animal, and then it just like starts gushing blood out of his hands. Like, that was a great moment. And obviously when he almost shoots Matt and Karen because he's been hallucinating, and he sees like his wife who's like blind and she's like feeling around trying to find him essentially. Like, I loved that moment because, again, it's a little more effective in that there's that emotional attachment to the scare itself. Like, it's targeting his grief and his trauma. It's not kind of just this demonic face that jumps out of somewhere. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I was excited for that moment because, especially on the first watch through, when that guy shows up, I'm like, all right, here we go. Here's the, real demonic presence that I've been kind of wanting this whole movie. And still, I mean, it was 2 minutes. It was a very powerful 2 minutes. And then it was kind of over. And then I was kind of looking for more, things like that. Maybe someone, a shadow walking down the hall or whatever. But, it didn't happen. But I think it was just enough to keep me invested and to kind of see how these characters are unhinging. They're just falling apart, and how it. And so I would like to ask, like, how much of that do you think was the devil? How much of that was just family stress or whatever? And do you think that at this point in the movie there's more interaction with the devil? Would you have liked to see the devil on the television screen? Would you like to have had more interaction with the devil, or do you think that the pacing was proper at like the escalation was on point?
So I would agree. I really think the escalation is done well, because that back half of the movie, things just continue to escalate, not only in terms of the devil's kind of influence on people, where people start hallucinating and these things, but also you see the culmination of this relationship between the three characters unraveling to the point that we see Steve ends up stabbing his brother and kills him. Mm-hmm. And then obviously Karen ends up shooting Steve at the end of the movie. So in that regards, I think the movie escalates really well in terms of these big kind of conclusion moments that end out the film. Again, though, I think early on, I would have liked to have seen a couple more instances of not really subtle, but just not necessarily scares, but things that are indicative of Steve's behavior, his new kind of like strange behavior. And it's up to the viewer to kind of decide whether he's unhinged or he's actually onto something. Like, I wish they had gotten to the attic scene quicker, where we see that he's been connecting all these pieces of red string on the ceilings, all these random news articles and all of these, I think like Bible verses and demonic scripture and things like that, trying to make connections. I wish we'd gotten to something like that a little faster, or another instance like that, where on the surface, these are the actions of somebody that is incredibly unhinged and needs help. Mm-hmm. Or at the same time, he's basically like a demonologist, and he's the one that has the answers to the predicament that they're in.
Right.
I mean, it's one of those things where more instances of that would have been welcomed, but at the same time, what instances we do get, I think, are very effective in terms of that.
Exactly. Yeah.
But in terms of that ending, what did you think of that ending?
It was, I don't know. I thought it was, up until they let the devil out, I liked it. It was really tense because Karen was there dying. There's 3 bodies, pretty much leading to the basement. And you have this young police officer, he's, terrified. She's she's there not saying anything, shaking her head, telling him, don't open the door. And then he opens the door. And the devil, and the devil comes out. Of course, it's not what you expect it to be. And even it was a little confusing because early on, Steve says, you open the door and the devil will show you what you fear the most, or like manipulate your fears. And, it's a child, and so I don't know if that, it was a little cliche, I felt. But that scene leading up to the devil walking out, I thought was really good. It was really well done. A lot of tension, a lot of stress, which I think that scene needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that lead up is really imperative. I mean, I think it worked a little bit better for me just because I was assuming that the movie was going to end and the one big kind of reveal was going to be a literal depiction of the devil, something along the lines you would expect. Or at the very least, like, it was one of two things. It was either that or it was going to be a man, because we've been hearing a man's voice the entire movie, basically from behind that wall. So in terms of it being like this little girl, I thought that was a good contrast to what I assumed it was going to be. Right. And so in that regard, I liked it. And I mean, I liked that it was, what made it creepier, obviously, is that the cop is just standing there staring at her, and he's just like completely wigged out of his mind. He just doesn't know how to react to that, because obviously nobody would. And then you just see her kind of like dancing up the stairs and laughing, and then just runs out of the house, basically. And I liked that in terms of just like, okay, the devil has now been freed. You trapped it and now it's freed. And like, I even think it would have been interesting if it had just gone, because when she leaves the front door, you can see that there's a house right across the street. I think it would have been interesting to see if like she just walked into the next house and she was like,
right.
I'm just, that's my next set of victims. And
Yeah,
this idea
looked
that,
around and
yeah, the idea that it's like, oh, that house caught my eye. That's going to be my next set of victims kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So in that regards, I liked it, but I would agree that if the movie wasn't as, again, like atmospheric, if it wasn't so concerned with setting this very oppressive mood, I think a lot of the movie would kind of fall apart, because that's really what it has going for it in a way that sets it apart from a lot of conventional horror movies that deal with kind of like demonic possession and things like that. So yeah, this definitely made me a fan of Josh Lobo. And this is one of those movies though that I really feel like if the next person I recommend this to, I need to tell them just to stick with it.
Yeah.
Cause I mean, I hate prefacing recommending a movie to somebody and I'm like, you need to watch it twice. Cause then somebody's going to be like, why would I watch that then? I don't want to dedicate. It's a 90-minute movie, but if I have to watch it twice, then it's an hour, 180-minute commitment. And it's like one of those things that you let percolate. How long did you wait to revisit it?
Let's see. I think I watched it so I watched it on Saturday and then we spoke about it Sunday. I watched it again Monday night. Yeah, I wanted to get back into it and while it was still fresh the first time, I wanted to watch it. And then I actually watched it again a few days later with my girlfriend, Candace, because she's into horror movies and scary movies. So I wanted to get her 2 cents on it and see what she thought. And she enjoyed it too. And
nice.
Yeah. And, like you said, it's only 90 minutes. It's really not that much. It's not like a feature film where it's, 2 hours or, an hour and hour and a half, hour, 45 minutes. So it's a quick watch.
I think we can both agree this would not make a good 2-hour movie.
No. Yeah.
But is this one of those types of movies? Because the first time we talked when we were reviewing The Ritual, you had said that you don't go off really the beaten path generally for horror movies in terms of just like exploring the smaller kind of indie stuff, mostly kind of just the mainstream horror stuff. Is this one of those movies that would make you more willing to kind of explore horror in different subgenres that you normally wouldn't, whether that be moving away from just high budget stuff to kind of some low budget indie stuff?
Yeah, I definitely would be willing to explore a little bit more. And I was kind of happy that you mentioned that it was like Twilight Zone, because I do enjoy the Twilight Zone movies and, some Alfred Hitchcock movies where it's more writing driven and not so much practical effects and, people getting blown up. I like to get invested in the characters and I like good writing. And so with this, since it seems like, his aim wasn't a huge movie and he was able to focus on the writing, that I enjoyed it a lot more because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think had they not had, especially Steve's performance, I think it really just complements the writing, and it is a really strong testament to this idea that if you invest in your characters and you don't kind of make them secondary, in the long run, you're going to make a film that can appeal to even people that aren't necessarily the biggest horror fans. At the same time, though, who doesn't enjoy well-written characters and kind of the relationships and making them more multi-layered instead of kind of just being these one-dimensional characters.
Yeah.
But in wrapping out, was there any last-minute scene or point that we didn't talk about?
I don't know if you remember, that fortification scene where they're sitting in the table and Steve has a gun in their face, and then all of a sudden the lights flicker, and then Steve just kind of he's like, oh fuck, no one leaves. Pretty much go to your room, and then he starts boarding up the doors and boarding up the windows and everything. And he kind of has this, there's no dialogue. It's just kind of music. And Steve's in the basement, seemingly that he's getting ready for war. He's getting ready for this huge, closure fight. And the couple times that I watched it, the first time I saw it, it didn't really work for me. I didn't understand why the Lobo decided to put that, because he dedicated 5 or 10 minutes to it.
Yeah, it goes on for a bit.
And so I was curious as to your thoughts. Why do you think he added that specific? Because it's almost dead center in the movie. It's right before the climax or the escalation. But So like, why did he add it? And then what were your takes on that scene specifically, or those scenes rather?
I think those scenes really reinforce this idea that that moment where it's like the call is coming from inside the house. There's no outside threat that's coming here. Basically, the threat is already there, and it's Karen and Matt, even though they're not actively a threat. At the same time, though, they're being, I believe that, and I think we agree on that, that they're being manipulated for being there. Like, why else would they just suddenly stop by unexpectedly and not even call? It's like, no, and Steve even says that. He's like, this is not just some coincidence. Why would this be a coincidence that you guys now show up when this trapping of the devil in the basement is like very much escalating? And it's like, this is the next thing that's going to kind of send it over the precipice. And so, again, I think at that moment, we're still not really sure whether or not there's actually the devil in the basement. Even though there's that moment with him and Karen. At the same time, though, maybe you don't know. Like, there's just some uncertainty still, and we see that, is it a coincidence that his brother is having this kind of mental breakdown, or is it that it's both? And so I think just, again, it's a moment to show, and it establishes that Matt and Karen are upstairs isolated, and they're very much terrified of him, when in reality, he's doing everything that he can to protect them.
Right. Yeah. It was kind of this moment of showing Matt being unhinged and him just kind of falling over that edge of, I think the devil has finally gotten to him.
Well, when he breaks out the gun, it's pretty apparent that he's kind of just ramping up more and more. And I think when you're looking at it from Matt and Karen's perspective, it's terrifying because you see the gun come out and you're like, okay, now things are different on the surface. Like, there was this kind of uneven on the surface, like it could go either way. And now we're fully going into the realm of like, he is not safe
delusion.
To be around.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. Delusional. And it's one thing when he's pinning up posters on the wall and he's got the string attaching everything. But then like when you introduce a gun into it, there's very much that kind of just gut punch tension where it's just like, this can go real sour real quick.
Right. And that kind of ties back to when they first arrive, that opening scene with Karen's outside smoking a cigarette and she finds all those spent shells in the driveway. Who was he shooting at? Was he shooting at people? Was he shooting at ghosts or, quote unquote ghosts? Or so, yeah, there's a lot of questions left unanswered, but I think they're not really, I think they're good questions, to piques my curiosity as to the rest of the movie.
That was the one scene that on a rewatch didn't make a lot of sense to me, the shell casings, because I had forgotten that the way that the film opens with the police basically breaking into the house, I had thought that was the beginning of the movie, and we were assuming that the shell casings were theirs because they had gotten into a shootout or they were shooting at something.
Right.
But then we learned that that's actually, the intro scene is actually the ending of the movie when the police come in, and then obviously Karen shoots one of the cops when he comes downstairs because he scares her. So that scene didn't really make sense to me, especially we learned that he lives in a neighborhood. So it was like, he was just like shooting his gun off in the neighborhood and nobody said anything or.
Right. How many times had the police come to the house? Already?
Right. I mean, that's like a nitpicky thing, but that was one of the moments of the film that I was kind of like, didn't understand really. But overall, like you said, I think there is a certain level of ambiguity to the ending that really complements it. Because again, it is this idea that the devil works in mysterious ways. And it's like, we don't know what the future holds for the people in that neighborhood or for people of a similar kind of like grief that the devil can look to exploit in a lot of different ways. And this was definitely one of those. I'm not usually like the biggest demonic horror guy in terms of just, I mean, I don't know. It's not one of my big interests, but I think when you do enough to form a Twilight Zone-esque atmosphere and then have these really character-driven interactions between them, and not just, like you said, focus on a lot of kind of like in-your-face bloody moments or like literal depictions of the devil, I think really complements this in a way that I think The Conjuring and other films don't capture nearly as well.
Right. Yeah. And that little portrait that he hangs on the door, that black and white, I think that was terrifying. That made me really, it was a really, I don't know if he did that because they mentioned that briefly at dinner. That's a very interesting piece you got there, but they never show what that piece is until he's sitting in the foyer, the entryway, and he tacks it to the door. Yeah.
I think that again, like you said, that is an instance that's scarier than I think if we saw an actual like devil or something. Because again, it's more about, it's tied into his psyche And at that point, obviously, we're still trying to decipher whether or not he's unhinged or not. And it's more frightening because it's like his depiction of what's in his head and whether that's real or not. At the same time, like the fact that his mind was able to conjure up that image, it's just like, how fucked is he in the head if that's something he made up? Or it's even more terrifying if it's something that he's seen, even though we don't physically see it.
Right.
Yeah, moments like that, I think they just go a long way in speaking more to the human condition in a way. And I don't know, that stuff always scares me more, because if there was, at the end of the day, if the movie revealed at the end that it's just some guy, the movie is infinitely more scarier than if there's actually the devil. In some ways, like the ending that we got, I don't think it's bad, but at the same time, for me, I think it would have been scarier if there was no demon. You know what I mean? Because then it just shows like it's another reinforcement of the horror that people are able to enact on one another.
Yeah. I think, I was kind of, part of me was hoping that it wasn't actually the devil, that it was, this guy that, the guy who caused whatever accident. Steve does mention, the man who did it isn't evil. Like, I'm not mad at him. I'm not mad. He didn't do, his accident wasn't evil, but evil allowed it. And to still hold the guy responsible in the basement, or even if it was even if it was kind of, the police officer opened the door and there was a zoom in shot to blackness. And then all you hear at the end is, this voice saying, thank you, or finally, or, something else where you don't actually see the devil, I think would have been a more solid ending. That being said, seeing the child was also, it was good. It was still good.
It was serviceable. I mean, you could only have those one or two outcomes. And even though maybe we didn't get the outcome that we probably would have preferred, I think what we got still was perfectly serviceable, and it feels in line. And again, it has that little surprise element there at the end where you assume it's a man and then obviously it's not. I think that still is perfectly serviceable for the movie. But I think that's a pretty good place to wrap up. I definitely appreciate you taking a chance on a movie that was a little outside your comfort zone, but I think in the long run, maybe I'll be able to recommend some more that are kind of like off the beaten path. Yeah,
I definitely will try to watch as many. You have a pretty good, your suggestions come out pretty well, so I'll take your word for it. You definitely know better than I do.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of other hobbies than watching movies, so
there's not much else to do.
I appreciate you coming on again, and I look forward to having you in the future. I think we're gonna try to get Berto in for a 3-person podcast one of these days. So I look forward to that.
Yeah, man, definitely.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service and follow @Daily Horror Habit on Instagram and @Daily Horror Pod on Twitter.